The police suddenly came to my house and told me, "We are going to arrest your son for a $100,000 robbery." But the police came inside. When they saw my son, they were shocked. I replied, "My son is." My name is Helen Chen, and this is the story of how my ex-husband's greed and manipulation finally caught up with him in the most spectacular way possible. It all started 4 years ago when I divorced Marcus Thompson. We'd been married for 15 years, and I thought we had a good life together. We lived in a beautiful house in suburban Denver, Colorado. Marcus worked as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown, and I was a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. We had our son, David, who was born with cerebral palsy. David is now 18, uses a wheelchair, and despite his physical challenges, he's one of the smartest, most determined kids you'll ever meet. The divorce was ugly. Marcus had been having an affair with his secretary, Jessica Walsh, for 2 years before I found out. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he told me he was done playing house with a referring to our son. Those words still make my blood boil. During the divorce proceedings, Marcus fought tooth and nail to avoid paying child support. He claimed David's medical expenses were excessive and that I was milking the system. He hired the most expensive lawyer in town, Richard Sterling, and together they painted me as a vindictive ex-wife, trying to bleed him dry. What really infuriated me was how he tried to minimize David's needs. Our son requires physical therapy, occupational therapy, special equipment, medications, and regular medical appointments. The costs add up quickly, but Marcus acted like I was asking for luxury items instead of basic necessities for our disabled child. The judge awarded me primary custody and ordered Marcus to pay $3,200 monthly in child support, plus half of David's medical expenses. Marcus was furious. He stormed out of the courthouse screaming that he'd find a way around this. I should have taken that threat more seriously. For the first 6 months after the divorce, Marcus paid regularly. Then the payments started coming late, first by a few days, then weeks. When I call him, he'd make excuses about cash flow issues or claim his business was slow. Meanwhile, I saw on social media that he and Jessica had moved into a luxury condo downtown and were taking expensive vacations to Hawaii and Europe. By the end of the first year, Marcus was 3 months behind on payments. I had to take him back to court for contempt. The judge was not pleased and threatened him with jail time if he didn't catch up immediately. Marcus paid what he owed that day, but I could see the hatred in his eyes. He blamed me for embarrassing him in front of his colleagues and clients who were at the courthouse for other matters. That's when things got really nasty. Marcus started playing games with the payment schedule. He'd send checks that would bounce, then claim it was a bank error. He'd pay partial amounts and argue that he paid in full. He'd send payments to the wrong address and then claim he'd sent them on time. Each time I have to contact my lawyer, file motions, and go back to court. It was exhausting and expensive. But the worst part was how he treated David during his court-mandated visitation. Marcus was supposed to have David every other weekend, but he'd frequently cancel at the last minute, leaving David disappointed and confused. When he did show up, he'd complain about having to accommodate David's wheelchair or medication schedule. He'd take David to places that weren't wheelchair accessible and then act frustrated when David couldn't participate in activities. One particularly awful incident happened when David was 14. Marcus picked him up for a weekend visit and decided to take him to a baseball game. Instead of using the accessible entrance and seating area I'd arranged, Marcus tried to carry David up regular stadium stairs. David fell and broke his wrist. Marcus didn't even call me until 3 hours later, and when I met them at the hospital, he had the nerve to blame David for being too heavy and not cooperating. That was the last straw for David. He told me he didn't want to see his father anymore unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't force the issue, and Marcus didn't seem to care. His visits became even more sporadic. The impact on David's emotional well-being was devastating. My son, who had always been remarkably positive despite his physical challenges, started withdrawing from activities he loved. His grades, which had always been excellent, began to slip. I noticed he'd stopped talking about his father entirely, which worried me more than his previous complaints about Marcus's behavior. I decided David needed professional help to process his feelings about his father's abandonment. I found Dr. Amanda Foster, a therapist who specialized in working with disabled teenagers and family trauma. The sessions were expensive, another cost Marcus should have been helping with, but they were necessary. During one particularly emotional session that Dr. Foster allowed me to attend, David broke down completely. "Mom, what's wrong with me?" he sobbed. "Why doesn't Dad love me? Is it because I'm in a wheelchair? Would he love me if I could walk?" My heart shattered into a million pieces. I held my son while he cried and assured him that his father's failures had nothing to do with him. But inside, my rage toward Marcus grew exponentially. It was one thing for him to abandon his financial responsibilities. It was another thing entirely for him to psychologically damage our child. Foster explained that children of divorce often blame themselves, but disabled children face additional challenges. "David is wondering if his disability is the reason his father left," she told me privately. "This is incredibly damaging to his self-esteem and his ability to form healthy relationships in the future." The therapy sessions revealed just how much damage Marcus had done. David admitted that he'd been having nightmares about being abandoned in public places because he couldn't keep up. He developed anxiety about asking for help with anything, fearing people would see him as a burden the way his father did. One evening, about 6 months after David started therapy, he asked me a question that nearly broke me. "Mom, do you ever wish I was different? Do you ever wish I didn't need so much help?" I sat down next to his wheelchair and took his hands in mine. "David Chen Thompson," I said firmly, using his full name the way I did when he was little and needed to pay attention. "You are exactly the person you're supposed to be. Your disability isn't something to be ashamed of or apologize for. It's part of what makes you incredible. You've overcome challenges most people never face, and you've done it with grace and determination. I have never, not for 1 second, wished you were different." "But Dad does," David said quietly. "Your father is an idiot," I said, surprising us both with my bluntness. "He's missing out on knowing the most amazing person I've ever met. His loss doesn't define your worth." Around the same time, I started noticing some disturbing patterns in Marcus's behavior that went beyond just avoiding child support. During the rare times he did call or text David, he would make comments that seemed designed to gather information about our financial situation. He'd asked David about what medical equipment we purchased recently, which doctors we were seeing, and whether insurance was covering various treatments. At first, I thought Marcus was actually showing some interest in David's well-being, but something felt off about the way he asked these questions. They were too specific, too focused on dollar amounts and insurance procedures. It reminded me of the way he used to interrogate me about household expenses when we were married. Not out of concern, but out of a desire to control and manipulate. I mentioned this to Jennifer, my lawyer, during one of our meetings about the mounting back child support. She found it odd too, especially since Marcus had previously shown zero interest in David's medical care. "Has he asked for copies of any medical records or bills?" Jennifer asked. I thought about it and realized that yes, Marcus had requested copies of David's recent MRI results and physical therapy evaluations, claiming he needed them for his records. I'd sent them to him, thinking it showed he was finally taking some responsibility as a parent. "That's unusual," Jennifer said. "Given his complete lack of involvement in David's care, why would he suddenly need detailed medical documentation?" That conversation planted a seed of suspicion that would later prove crucial to uncovering Marcus's crimes. Meanwhile, Marcus's manipulation tactics became more sophisticated. When he was several months behind on child support, he started sending David expensive gifts, a new gaming system, designer clothes, tech gadgets that cost hundreds of dollars each. David would come to me confused, holding a $300 pair of sneakers and asking why his father could afford luxury items, but claimed he couldn't pay for physical therapy. The gifts came with notes that were clearly designed to manipulate David's emotions. "Sorry, I can't see you more often. Work has been crazy, but I'm thinking about you. Love, Dad, or hope you like these. I know I haven't been the best father lately, but I'm trying to get back on my feet financially." Doctor. Foster identified this behavior immediately as a classic manipulation tactic. He's trying to maintain David's emotional attachment while avoiding his actual responsibilities, she explained. The expensive gifts are meant to create guilt and confusion. David receives something valuable, so he feels like he should be grateful and not complain about his father's absence or failure to provide consistent support. The strategy was working. David started defending Marcus when I expressed frustration about the unpaid child support. Maybe Dad really is having money problems. "Mom, he sent me this expensive tablet, so he must care about me." I realized I needed to have an honest conversation with David about his father's manipulation. It was one of the hardest discussions I've ever had as a parent. "David," I said one evening after he'd received another expensive gift, "a $400 drone this time. I need to explain something about your father's behavior." When someone consistently fails to meet their basic responsibilities, but occasionally gives expensive gifts, it's often a manipulation tactic. David looked confused and a little defensive. "What do you mean? Your father owes $52,000 in child support right now. That money is supposed to pay for your food, housing, medical care, and daily needs. Instead of paying that debt, he's buying you gifts that cost hundreds of dollars. If he can afford a $400 drone, why can't he afford to send the $3,200 per month the court ordered?" I could see David processing this information, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to hurt. "So the gifts aren't because he loves me, they're to make me not be mad about the other stuff. The gifts might come from love, but the pattern is manipulative. A parent who truly prioritizes their child's well-being pays for necessities first, luxuries second. Your father is doing the opposite." That conversation marked a turning point in David's relationship with his father. He started questioning Marcus's motives more critically and became less defensive about the child support situation. But Marcus wasn't done with his games. When his manipulation tactics with David didn't completely work, he tried a different approach, attempting to turn David against me. During one of his rare phone calls, Marcus told David that I was poisoning him against his father and that the child support amount was ridiculously excessive. He claimed that I was living off the support money and using David's disability to milk the system. David, who is now 16 and much more mature than Marcus gave him credit for, saw right through this attempt. He hung up on his father and came to me immediately. "Mom, Dad just told me you're stealing his money and using my disability to get rich. He said the child support is supposed to be way less than what you're asking for." I was proud of David for recognizing the manipulation, but I was also furious that Marcus would try to turn our son against me with such obvious lies. "David, would you like to see exactly where the child support money goes?" I asked. I showed David our household budget, breaking down exactly how much of the child support went to his medical expenses, equipment needs, and daily care. I showed him the receipts for his wheelchair maintenance, his medication costs, his therapy appointments, and his special dietary requirements. "The child support doesn't even cover half of your actual expenses," I explained. "The rest comes from my salary and savings. Your father isn't overpaying. He's underpaying by about $1,800 per month, even when he does pay on time." David studied the numbers carefully. Despite being only 16, he was excellent at math and could clearly see that Marcus's claims were completely false. So Dad was lying about everything. Yes, he was. That was the last time David expressed any sympathy for his father's financial situation. Around this time, I also discovered another layer of Marcus's deception that made my blood boil. Through social media posts that Jessica wasn't careful enough to keep private, I learned that Marcus had been telling people in his social circle that David had died. A mutual acquaintance, Rebecca Martinez, who I'd known since high school, approached me at the grocery store with tears in her eyes. "Helen, I'm so sorry for your loss. I just heard about David from Jessica's Facebook post. I can't imagine what you're going through." I stared at her in complete confusion. "What are you talking about, Rebecca?" "David's fine. He's at home doing homework." Rebecca looked equally confused, but Jessica posted about how hard it's been for Marcus losing his son. She said, "You were keeping David's death a secret because you couldn't handle people's sympathy." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus was telling people our son was dead to avoid explaining why he never talked about David or included him in any social activities. I immediately called Jennifer, my lawyer, and told her what I discovered. She was as appalled as I was. This is potentially grounds for additional legal action. She said Marcus is essentially committing fraud by claiming his son is deceased, especially if he's used that lie to gain sympathy or avoid responsibilities. We documented this deception carefully, gathering screenshots of social media posts and statements from people who had been told David was dead. This evidence would later become crucial in demonstrating Marcus's character to both the family court and eventually the criminal court. The psychological impact on David when he learned about his father's lies was devastating. Dr. Foster had to increase his therapy sessions to twice weekly for a month, while he processed the fact that his father was literally pretending he didn't exist. "He's erasing me," David said during one particularly difficult session that I attended. "It's not enough that he abandoned me. He's telling people I'm dead so he doesn't have to explain why he's not in my life." This revelation marked the point where David completely gave up hope of ever having a relationship with his father before. Despite all of Marcus's failures, David had held on to some small hope that his father might change. Learning that Marcus was denying his very existence eliminated that hope entirely. "Mom," David said one night as I was helping him with his physical therapy exercises, "I don't want Dad's last name anymore. Can I change it to just Chen?" The legal name change process took several months, but on David's 17th birthday, he officially became David Chen, dropping the Thompson name entirely. Marcus didn't even know about the name change because he hadn't called or visited in over 6 months. Meanwhile, the child support situation got worse. By David's 17th birthday, Marcus owed over $73,000 in back support. My lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, kept filing motions and contempt charges, but Marcus had gotten craftier. He started hiding his assets. He quit his job at the financial firm and claimed he was between positions while actually working as a freelance consultant, getting paid in cash and through shell companies. Jennifer discovered that Marcus had opened several business accounts under different names and was funneling money through them to avoid garnishment. He'd also transferred ownership of his expensive car to Jessica and was living in her name in the condo. On paper, he looked broke, but in reality, he was making more money than ever. The breaking point came 8 months ago. David needed surgery to correct a hip displacement that was causing him severe pain. The procedure cost $48,000, and Marcus was responsible for half, according to our divorce decree. When I presented him with a bill, he laughed in my face and said, "Good luck collecting that from someone who's unemployed." I was beyond furious. I'd been covering all of David's expenses myself, working double shifts at the hospital, and taking on extra weekend assignments just to make ends meet. I'd already dipped into my retirement savings and was considering taking out a second mortgage on my house. That's when I decided to get serious about investigating Marcus's finances. I hired a private investigator, Robert Kim, who specialized in tracking hidden assets. What Bob uncovered over the next 3 months was shocking even to me. Marcus wasn't just hiding money, he was stealing it. Bob discovered that Marcus had been running an elaborate investment scam through his consulting business. He'd been convincing elderly clients to invest in fake overseas opportunities, promising huge returns while actually funneling their money into his personal accounts. The total amount stolen was over $847,000 from 12 different victims. But here's the most infuriating part. Marcus had been using David's cerebral palsy as part of his con game. He'd tell potential victims that he needed money quickly because he had a disabled son with mounting medical bills, and that he discovered a sure-thing investment that would help him provide for his child's future. He'd even show them fake medical bills and David's old medical records to gain sympathy. Bob's investigation revealed the full scope of Marcus's twisted scheme. Marcus had created an entire fictional narrative around David's medical needs, claiming that his son required experimental treatments not covered by insurance. He'd shown potential investors fabricated medical bills for procedures that David never received, surgeries that were never recommended, and equipment that was never purchased. What made this especially sick was that some of these fake medical expenses were for treatments that David actually did need, but that Marcus had refused to help pay for. For example, Marcus had shown investors a fake $15,000 bill for specialized wheelchair modifications, while the real David was stuck with an old, uncomfortable wheelchair because Marcus wouldn't contribute to the cost of necessary upgrades. Bob discovered that Marcus had even gone so far as to create fake email accounts pretending to be David's doctors, sending investors urgent messages about David's deteriorating condition and the need for immediate funding for life-saving treatments. Dr. Patricia Williams, David's actual neurologist, was horrified when Bob showed her the fake emails using her name and medical credentials. "This is not only insurance fraud and identity theft," Dr. Williams told me when I met with her to discuss the situation. It's a profound violation of David's privacy and dignity. Your ex-husband has essentially created a fictional version of your son's medical condition to exploit vulnerable people. The investigation also revealed that Marcus had been secretly photographing David during his court-mandated visits, taking pictures when David was having difficult days with pain or fatigue, and then showing these photos to potential investors as proof of his son's deteriorating condition. He captioned the photos with lies like David after his latest surgery, or "This is what cerebral palsy progression looks like." I felt physically ill when Bob showed me these photos on Marcus's phone, which had been seized during a search warrant. My son's private moments of struggle had been turned into props for his father's criminal enterprise. David's trust and vulnerability had been weaponized against innocent elderly people. Bob also uncovered evidence that Marcus had been researching other families with disabled children, apparently planning to expand his scheme by creating fake personas based on other people's real children. He had files on 6 other families, complete with photos he'd stolen from social media accounts and fabricated medical histories. Your ex-husband is a special kind of predator, Bob told me grimly. He preys on elderly people's compassion for disabled children while simultaneously abandoning his own disabled child. I've investigated a lot of financial fraud cases, but I've never seen anything quite this psychologically twisted. The evidence Bob had gathered was so comprehensive that Detective Rodriguez told me it was one of the most well-documented fraud cases she'd ever seen. Bank records showed that Marcus had collected $847,000 from his victims over an 18-month period, with every transaction traced and documented. But the emotional evidence was even more damaging to Marcus's character. Bob had recorded phone conversations where Marcus described David's medical needs in detail to potential investors. Needs that Marcus knew intimately because he'd lived with David for the first 14 years of his life, but that he was actively refusing to help address. In one particularly disturbing recording that Bob obtained through a federal wiretap warrant executed by the FBI, Marcus told an 80-year-old potential investor, "My son David has cerebral palsy, and while his condition is stable, he needs a $25,000 mobility equipment upgrade next month. I found an investment opportunity that could triple our money in 6 weeks, which would give me enough to pay for David's equipment and give you a substantial return on your investment." None of that was true. David wasn't deteriorating. He didn't need surgery, and there was no investment opportunity. But Marcus's intimate knowledge of David's real condition made his lies sound convincing and medically accurate. When I played this recording for David, with Dr. Foster present to provide support, my son's reaction was a mixture of heartbreak and rage. "He knows exactly what's wrong with me and exactly what I need," David said, tears streaming down his face. "He lived with us for 14 years. He knows my medical history better than almost anyone, and he used that knowledge to lie to old people and steal their money while telling me he couldn't afford to help with my real medical bills." Dr. Foster helped David process this betrayal over several sessions. "Your father's actions represent a complete perversion of the parent-child relationship," she explained. "He took his intimate knowledge of your needs, knowledge that should have been used to care for and protect you, and weaponized it against vulnerable people for his own financial gain." The federal investigation also revealed that Marcus had been keeping detailed files on David's medical conditions, not out of parental concern, but to make his fraud more convincing. He had copies of every medical report, every therapy evaluation, every insurance claim related to David's care. He'd studied this information not to better understand his son's needs, but to create more believable lies for his victims. Bob found evidence that Marcus had even contacted David's former teachers and therapists, claiming he was putting together a medical portfolio for insurance purposes and asking for detailed reports about David's challenges and progress. These professionals, thinking they were helping a concerned parent, had unknowingly provided Marcus with ammunition for his fraud scheme. The level of premeditation and manipulation was staggering. Marcus hadn't stumbled into using David's condition as part of a con game. He had systematically and deliberately constructed an elaborate fraud scheme based on exploiting both his son's disability and elderly people's compassion. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Bob discovered that Marcus had been refining his approach based on which aspects of David's condition generated the most sympathy and donations from victims. He kept spreadsheets tracking which medical emergencies resulted in the largest investments, and he adjusted his stories accordingly. Your ex-husband turned your son's medical condition into a business model, Bob told me during our final meeting before involving the police. He analyzed what aspects of David's disability were most profitable and optimized his fraud accordingly. It's one of the most cold-blooded schemes I've ever uncovered. Bob also discovered that Marcus and Jessica had been living it up with the stolen money. They bought a $75,000 boat, taken 5 luxury vacations in the past year, and Jessica was sporting a $30,000 engagement ring, all while claiming he couldn't afford to support his actual disabled son. I was sickened. Not only was Marcus refusing to support David, but he was actually exploiting David's disability to steal from vulnerable elderly people. Some of the victims had lost their entire life savings. I knew I had to act, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. If I went to the police immediately, Marcus might get tipped off and flee with whatever money he had left. Instead, Bob and I spent another month gathering ironclad evidence. We documented at every transaction, every fake investment document, every lie Marcus had told to his victims. We also discovered something interesting about Marcus's pattern. Every Friday evening, he and Jessica would go to an upscale restaurant called the Metropolitan Grill to celebrate their successful week. They'd always sit at the same corner table, order expensive wine, and Marcus would often make loud phone calls to potential new victims, thinking the ambient noise of the restaurant would provide privacy. Bob suggested we set up surveillance to record Marcus admitting to his crimes. Colorado is a one-party consent state, so as long as one person in a conversation consents to recording, it's legal. Bob had contacts who could help us get audio evidence of Marcus's confessions. But I had a better idea. I wanted Marcus to experience the same shock and humiliation that he'd put David and me through. I wanted him to face the consequences of his actions in the most public and devastating way possible. I spent 2 weeks planning every detail. First, I contacted Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit and presented her with all of our evidence. Detective Rodriguez was impressed with the thoroughness of our investigation and immediately contacted the FBI since wire fraud falls under federal jurisdiction. FBI Special Agent Michael Torres took over the case and agreed that they had enough evidence to arrest Marcus immediately. However, I asked Detective Rodriguez and Agent Torres if they could do me a favor. I explained Marcus's Friday night routine and asked if they could time the arrest for maximum impact. I also shared the full history of Marcus's treatment of David and his refusal to pay child support. Detective Rodriguez, who had a disabled nephew herself, was more than happy to accommodate my request, and Agent Torres agreed to coordinate the arrest. We set the trap for Friday, March 15th. Bob confirmed that Marcus and Jessica had reservations at the Metropolitan Grill for 8 p.m. At 7:30, I called Marcus and told him there was an emergency with David, that he'd had a seizure and was asking for his father. I begged Marcus to come to the house immediately. Marcus, probably sensing an opportunity to look like a concerned parent in front of potential witnesses, agreed to come right over. I could hear Jessica in the background asking if she should come too, and Marcus told her to go ahead to the restaurant and he'd meet her there after dealing with the kid. At exactly 8:15 p.m., Marcus's BMW pulled into my driveway. He was dressed in an expensive suit, clearly planning to go straight to dinner after his emergency visit with David. He rang the doorbell impatiently, checking his Rolex watch. When I opened the door, Marcus pushed past me rudely. "Where is he? What happened?" "I don't have all night, Helen. Jessica's waiting for me at dinner." "He's in the living room," I said calmly, leading Marcus inside. As we walked into the living room, Marcus saw David sitting in his wheelchair, reading a book, and looking perfectly fine. Marcus's face immediately changed to anger. "What the hell, Helen? You said he had a seizure. He looks fine to me." "Did you lie to get me over here? I should have known you'd pull some manipulative—" That's when the doorbell rang. "Excuse me," I said sweetly. "I'll get that." I opened the front door to find Detective Rodriguez and 3 other officers standing on my porch. "Mrs. Chen, we're here about Marcus Thompson. Is he inside?" "Yes, he is. Please come in." Marcus heard voices and came to the entryway. When he saw the police officers, his face went white. "Marcus Thompson?" Detective Rodriguez asked. "Yes, but I don't understand what—" "Mr. Thompson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and theft. You have the right to remain silent." Marcus's mouth fell open as Agent Torres read him his rights. He looked at me in shock and confusion. "Helen, what is this? What's going on? Why are the FBI here?" Agent Torres finished the Miranda rights and looked at Marcus seriously. "Mr. Thompson, we have evidence that you've been running an investment fraud scheme targeting elderly victims. We're here to arrest you for stealing approximately $847,000. Marcus's knees nearly buckled. "That's impossible. You can't prove anything. I haven't stolen any money." "Actually, we can prove it," Agent Torres said, pulling out a thick folder. "We have bank records, recorded phone conversations, testimony from victims, and documentation of your shell companies. The FBI has been investigating your activities for the past 3 months. That's when Marcus noticed Bob Kim stepping out from the kitchen, where he'd been quietly observing everything. You," Marcus pointed at Bob accusingly, "you're that private investigator." "Helen, you hired a PI to spy on me." "I hired Bob to find the child support money you owe David," I said calmly. "What we found was much more interesting. The FBI took over the investigation once we discovered the scope of your fraud." Agent Torres gestured for Marcus to turn around so he could handcuff him. As he did, he continued explaining the charges. "Mr. Thompson, we know about the fake overseas investment opportunities you've been selling to elderly clients. We know about the shell companies you set up to launder the stolen money. We know about the boat, the vacations, the expensive jewelry. Most disgustingly, we know how you've been using your disabled son's medical condition to gain sympathy from your victims." Marcus's face went from white to bright red. I never... "Helen, you have to believe me. I was just trying to make investments work. I wasn't stealing. The victims who lost their life savings might disagree," Detective Rodriguez said dryly. "Mrs. Patterson, 78 years old, gave you her entire $120,000 retirement fund because you showed her fake medical bills for David and told her you needed money for his treatment, Mr. Franklin, 82, lost $95,000 because you convinced him that David needed experimental surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. David, who had been listening to everything from his wheelchair, spoke up for the first time. Dad, you used my disability to steal from old people while refusing to pay for my actual medical care." Marcus looked at David, then at me, then at the police officers. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said desperately. "I can explain everything. The investments were legitimate. I was going to pay everyone back once the returns came in." "Mr. Thompson," Detective Rodriguez said patiently, "there were no investments. You spent the money on luxury items and vacations. We have the receipts." As they prepared to take Marcus away, Agent Torres turned to me. "Mrs. Chen, I should mention that we'll be seizing Mr. Thompson's assets as part of the federal investigation. The boat, the jewelry, the money, and the accounts we can locate. It will all be held as evidence and eventually used to compensate the victims. However, I understand Mr. Thompson owes significant child support, over $78,000 at this point." I confirmed. "The federal court will likely treat that as a priority debt when assets are distributed. You should contact the U.S. Attorney's Office about filing a victim impact statement." Marcus was staring at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Helen, you destroyed my life. You're vindictive. This is all because I wanted a divorce." "No, Marcus," I said quietly. "This is because you're a thief who abandoned his disabled son and exploited vulnerable elderly people. You destroyed your own life." As the FBI agents led Marcus toward the door in handcuffs, David called out, "Dad, I hope the money was worth it." Marcus stopped and looked back at David. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been remorse cross his face, but then he hardened again. "This isn't over, Helen," he said as Agent Torres guided him out the door. But it was over, at least the worst part. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The local news picked up the story, and Marcus's arrest made headlines. Financial advisor arrested for elder fraud, used disabled son's condition in scam. The story detailed how Marcus had been living lavishly while owing nearly $78,000 in child support and refusing to pay for his son's medical care. Marcus's former colleagues were interviewed, and many expressed shock and disgust. His old boss at the financial firm said they'd received complaints about Marcus' conduct, which was part of why he'd been let go, though they hadn't realized the extent of his criminal activity. Jessica, his fiancée, immediately distanced herself from Marcus. She hired a lawyer and claimed she had no knowledge of the fraud, though investigators found evidence that she'd helped him set up some of the shell companies. She ended up cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. The $30,000 engagement ring, the $75,000 boat, and Marcus's luxury car were all seized. Police also froze approximately $180,000 in various accounts. It wasn't enough to fully compensate all the victims, but it was a start. Marcus was charged with 12 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of money laundering, and 3 counts of identity theft. His bail was set at $750,000, which he couldn't make from jail. His court-appointed attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't interested in being lenient. The federal trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified about Marcus's refusal to pay child support and how he'd used David's medical records as props in his con game. David, who is now 18, also testified about how his father had abandoned him and then exploited his disability for criminal purposes. The most powerful testimony came from the elderly victims, Mrs. Patterson, the 78-year-old, who'd lost her retirement savings, broke down in tears, describing how Marcus had shown her David's medical records and convinced her that investing with him would help a disabled child. Mr. Franklin, 82, testified that Marcus had told him David needed $50,000 worth of experimental treatment that wasn't covered by insurance. The jury took 8 hours to find Marcus guilty on all counts. The federal judge sentenced him to 14 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $847,000 in restitution to his victims. During the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood up in that courtroom and looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "Marcus Thompson is not just a thief. He's a man who abandoned his disabled son and then exploited that same child's medical condition to steal from vulnerable elderly people. He showed no remorse for his crimes and no concern for the victims whose life savings he stole. He had the audacity to use his son's cerebral palsy, a condition he was too ashamed to support, as a tool to gain sympathy from the people he was robbing." Marcus stared at the floor during my entire statement. "Your Honor, I don't ask for vengeance. I ask for justice. Marcus needs to understand that his actions have consequences, not just for him, but for the elderly people he victimized and for the son he abandoned." The judge thanked me and noted that Marcus's exploitation of his disabled son's condition was particularly egregious and had influenced the lengthy sentence. That was 10 months ago. Marcus is currently serving his sentence at a federal facility in Colorado. He'll be eligible for parole in about 10 years if he demonstrates good behavior, which frankly seems unlikely given his narcissistic personality. The seized assets were distributed among the victims and to cover the back child support Marcus owed. I received $78,000 to cover the unpaid support, plus an additional $15,000 from the sale of his luxury items. It wasn't enough to cover all of David's past medical expenses, but it was a huge help. More importantly, David finally got closure. The whole experience was difficult for him. Learning that his father had been exploiting his disability was heartbreaking. But David is resilient, and he said knowing that his father couldn't hurt anyone else made him feel better. "Mom," David told me the night after the sentencing, "I'm glad Dad's in prison. Not because I want him to suffer, but because now those old people won't lose any more money because of lies about me." David is now 18 and a senior in high school. He's been accepted to Colorado State University with a partial scholarship, and he wants to study computer science. Despite everything Marcus put him through, David has grown into a compassionate, intelligent young man who wants to use his skills to help other people. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice. I didn't set out to destroy Marcus's life. I set out to protect my son and uncover the truth about the money Marcus owed us. The fact that the truth revealed Marcus to be a criminal who was victimizing elderly people made his downfall inevitable. The irony isn't lost on me that Marcus spent years claiming he couldn't afford to support his disabled son, while simultaneously using that same son's condition to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent people. He could have used that money to pay his child support, to help with David's medical expenses, to be the father David deserved. Instead, he chose greed and selfishness. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus thinks about David while he's sitting in his prison cell. Does he regret abandoning his son? Does he regret using David's disability as a tool for his crimes? Does he regret choosing Jessica and luxury vacations over being a decent father and human being? Probably not. Marcus always was good at blaming everyone else for his problems, but David and I don't think about Marcus much anymore. We're too busy building our own future. David is now 18 and will graduate high school in 3 months. He's been accepted to Colorado State University with a partial scholarship, and he wants to study computer science. Despite everything Marcus put him through, David has grown into a compassionate, intelligent young man who wants to use his skills to help other people. As for the title of this story, when those police officers came to my house that night and saw David in his wheelchair, they were shocked because they had expected to find a healthy teenager. Instead, they found a disabled young man whose own father had been exploiting his condition to commit crimes against elderly people. When Detective Rodriguez asked me about David, I replied, "My son is the victim his father used to steal from innocent people, and he's also the strongest person I know." That night, justice was served. Not through revenge or manipulation, but through truth and consequences. Marcus Thompson got exactly what he deserved, and David got to see that sometimes the good guys really do win in the end. The best part, David doesn't have to worry about disappointing visits from his father anymore. He's free to focus on his future without the toxic influence of someone who saw his disability as either a burden or a tool for criminal gain. Marcus is exactly where he belongs, and David is exactly where he deserves to be, surrounded by people who love and support him unconditionally. Sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales, and this time it balanced them perfectly.